Hi, I'm Daniel Fisher here at Sweetwater Sound, and on today's episode of Synth Clips, we're going to talk about choosing a filter type. And this episode is not going to be so much about moving the filter as opposed to just which filter is right. We'll talk more about envelopes and LFOs and velocity moving filter later on, but right now it's just how do I pick of the ones that are available. I'm going to start with the ASM Hydrasynth. It has lots of choices, and it also shows the curves on the screen, so it's a good way to start, but I'll bring in some others as well just so you can hear sonically what some of the differences are. Again, as always, I start with an init, and it's my boring sawtooth wave, one oscillator only, and I'm gonna leave it at that for now, because sawtooth is just a great wave for testing things, and we're going to use the sawtooth going through different filters. So on the ASM Hydrasynth, the way you get to the filter is you look at the filter button that's in the literal audio path for the filter, and I press it, and I get various parameters. If I want to see some more parameters, I hit it a second time, I get to the second page, and that hitting that each time goes back and forth. And the very first knob is type. I have the cutoff all the way up, I have resonance all the way down, I have nothing modulating the filter, either envelopes or LFOs. None of my mod matrices are set to anything. Velocity is not doing. The only one I usually leave on is key tracking. I leave that 100% because it's pretty typical of how you'll use it. There are times when that's not the case, but man, often enough that it's what you want to do. I hit my note, and I'm going to say this in almost every episode, don't ever change anything, either what you're listening to or what its value is, unless you're playing a sound, because otherwise you're just guessing, right? So you'll notice that every time I change a cutoff, or anytime I change a filter type, or anytime I change an amount of resonance, I'm always holding something down to hear what I'm doing, okay? One, it teaches you what that knob does, and two, how the heck do you know where to set it if you can't hear what it's doing? And it's also just, it's easy to find the magic spot by sweeping too far before and after that magic spot, you know? And so you just kind of sweep around, and then you tighten up and you find a magic spot. I'm going to do that with this. So I'm going to choose the very first filter. It's a low-pass ladder filter. It has the number 12. That means it's a two-pole filter, and that means that every octave it gets 12 dB quieter when it's higher than the cutoff frequency. And the cutoff frequency is the big knob on almost every synth that's sweeping where the filter cuts off. And typically it's cutting off the high end, because most of the time people use low pass filters. They're just great in synths. Yeah, there are cases when band passes and notches and high pass are useful, but man, I tell you, 90% of the time it's a low pass filter. So I have a low pass ladder filter set at 12 dB per octave, cutting every time I go up 12 dB, it gets 12 dB quieter. And so I hit my note, and again, I'm not turning a knob until I'm hitting a note. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit. But now I'm going to slowly bring the cutoff level down. And you're going to see that value represented here. In this case, they're not showing you hertz. They're showing you 0 to 128. Different brands might show you 0 through 99. Other brands might show you the actual physical frequency in hertz, or capital H, small z. And clearly you can hear that as I am lowering that cutoff frequency, it's basically rolling off first the harmonics, or the overtones or the partials of that sound. But at some point, as that cutoff frequency gets to the fundamental, the basic frequency of that oscillator, it's also going to start lowering the volume of that oscillator. And if I have the filter set up right, it should actually go all the way to silence, like it did. So I'm going to do a full sweep at 12 dB per octave, or two-pole filter, and then I'll do it at 4-pole, which has a steeper roll-off. And I just want you to hear what the difference of that is. I might play one note, I might play a fifth. That's something I do with filters a lot. So I'll do the fifth and roll that down about halfway. and I'm going to go to 64 because that's in between on 128. And obviously you can hear it's darker, but you can still hear some frequencies on the high end. And that's typical for a 12 dB per octave filter, otherwise known as a two-pole filter. A one-pole filter is -6 dB per octave, two-pole is -12 per octave, a three-pole is -18 per octave, and a four-pole is -24 per octave. And I'm going to switch back and forth between the 12 and the 24 and show you. So here's the 12. I'm rolling off a lot of the high end, but there's still a little bit of magic living up there. Now listen as I set it to a 24 dB per octave. The fundamental sounds about the same, but all of a sudden you're not hearing the same amount of highs. That's because what we call the roll-off is much steeper. 24 dB, 12 dB. And so one of the things that you're going to use to choose which one should I use is, are you looking for a sound that when it gets dark, it still has a little shimmer on top? Or are you looking for a sound that when it gets dark, it's really dark? The more cutoff slope that it has, the more it's going to do that. So a 24 is going to let you get darker. And the 12 will let you still hear a little on top. Here it is. Here, there's just a little zzz to it. And now we go back to the 24. Pretty significant. And so that's one of the ways that I use to choose which filter shape. And if you have one that has more variations, it's just going to be subtle differences between them. But it's the way I use to decide which one. The other thing that I use to decide is, what does that filter sound like when the resonance is up? And I got to define that a little bit. What is resonance? Resonance is when you take the output of the filter and run it back into itself, not 100% because then it would go running away screaming, but some percentage. And so usually when I draw it coming out of the filter and going down, there's usually a little variable resistor right here, and then it comes back up and it comes back in, and so maybe I'm only sending 20% back or maybe 50% back. And filters, when you have a slope right before the cutoff, or actually right at the cutoff, there's a little bump where it actually makes that frequency area louder, right here, than the rest of the sound. And so when you do a feedback, that bump gets more accentuated. And it's good to see it in a drawing, but I really want you to hear it. So as I play a note, and I'll go down here, and I'll get a nice cutoff. So you can kind of hear the area where I'm moving that cutoff, right there. Right? Now listen as I turn resonance up, it's gonna boost right in that spot. And now all the way up to the point of it screaming. And it really does. And so, unless I'm going for that special effect, I usually don't have resonance up that high. When I do, it's to either do Star Wars-like weapons, pew, pew, you know, all of the pew-pews are done with very high resonance. Or if I'm trying to do like those really cheesy late 70s drums, the doo, doo, those are all done with resonance into a filter as well. You can put a little bit of noise into the filter to accentuate a little bit, but a lot of filters will self-resonate, self-oscillate all by themselves. But listen to the difference as I sweep. I'm going to set the resonance to halfway, and now I'm going to sweep the filter cutoff on a 12 dB per octave. And you can see the bump moving through the frequency range. And now with a 24. Back to 12. And so there's definitely a difference between the two. And if you're going to use resonance, you really want to make your filter choices while the resonance is up, because they are very interactive in terms of the sonic quality that they have. And so now I'm going to do some of the other filters that are in here. A lot of choices. So I just showed you a low pass, minus 12 and minus 24. Here's one called Fat. Also a ladder filter, but how the low frequencies are represented is a little stronger. I'm going to go down an octave, and I'm going to sweep through that. So here's the 12 on Fat version. And with some resonance. And the non-fat version. You can definitely hear it has less lows. Every filter type kind of treats the low end a little bit differently. Personally, I love Moog filters and I love how Moog filters sound. One of the things that a Moog filter does typically though is when you turn the resonance up, because it's severely punching wherever you have your cutoff set, obviously other frequencies around that aren't going to be as loud. So people say, oh, I can't hear the bass when I turn resonance up. Well, that's kind of what resonance does. However, there are filters that don't do that, and this Fat one is one of the ones that helps keep that bass there. Another trick though is if you have parallel filters, you can just use a low pass filter and have only the bass going through that and turn it up a little bit, so you can always have bass no matter what you do with your resonance. It's one of the things that's great about having two filter paths. But now I'm going to show you some of the other filters. So I'm going to turn the resonance back down, the cutoff all the way back up, and now we're going to do this low pass gate filter and just sweep it. And then same thing with some resonance. And now one from the Korg MS-20. And what you're hearing is just differences on what ratios of frequencies are getting through and how much in terms of loudness. And each of them have their own kind of unique shape. But get used to turning the cutoff knob while you're trying the different filter type, and then try it at different resonance amounts. And be sure to try different octaves. But because you're starting from an init, you really have a chance to hear this filter as it is. If you want to change to a different wave shape, fine, but sawtooth is a good wave shape to explore filters with, whether it's an actual analog sawtooth or a sampled sawtooth that's in a Rompler. Either way, it's the best wave to start with for listening to these things. I'll try some other filters. Here's a Highpass. So Highpass is definitely different from all these other filters we've listened to, in that instead of cutting highs, a Highpass passes the highs and cuts the lows. So as I turn this cutoff up, we're going to start losing lows. And that's typically used more for sound effect type things, you know. And typically things in nature get darker as opposed to getting thinner. So usually as you get farther away, things sound darker. As you throw more blankets on top of something, it gets darker. Very rarely can you do something to a sound in real life where all the high frequency stays but the lows completely drop out. But it is a good effect, and it's especially good if you're trying to mix one sound against another. You might have a darker sound and then you want this brighter sound that doesn't have low frequencies, and they blend together because they're not in the same range. So here is the Highpass, and now this time I'm going to add some resonance. So once again, a sweep. And now sweep with some resonance. And a sweep with a lot of resonance. And I'm not even going to turn that up farther because it can go farther than that. But one really interesting thing about high pass is if you have the resonance turned up and you're creating a bump wherever that cutoff is, if your cutoff is down in the low end, you're actually going to be boosting the low end. So where you normally might think of a high pass filter as a way to get rid of low end, if the resonance is up and the cutoff frequency is low, you might actually find it's a great way of getting bass boost. So that's something to explore. Try a couple more. This one's really interesting. This is a vowel filter, so I can get different vowels. And with some resonance. All right, so now let's try it on a different synth. Okay, so now I brought out the Moog Matriarch semi-modular analog synthesizer. And the reason I have this one is because of its filter. And it is a Moog ladder filter that can be low pass or high pass. But the thing that makes it really interesting is there's this switch, filter mode switch, that lets you go between series where you have a high pass filter with its own independent audio path, a low pass filter with its own independent audio path. Each has its own resonance, and you can change the cutoff of both, but there's a spacing knob that lets you offset the cutoff frequencies. There is the stereo mode, which lets you have an identical Moog low pass filter on each side, but they each have their own independent resonance amount, and the spacing control, again, offsets the cutoff frequency. So you can make some very interesting stereo changes. And then finally, there is the parallel mode, where you have an independent high pass filter on its own audio path and an independent low pass filter on its own path. And so then you can do different things and bring them back together later on. So now I'll show you some of those. Okay, so I've got a single sawtooth wave going just oscillator 1. I have 2, 3, and 4 shut off for right now. I want to keep it very simple. Got a nice low E there, and I'm just going to sweep the cutoff frequency. Notice that the resonance is all the way off, and I'm in the stereo low pass mode. I have my spacing set to center, so both sides should be identical. And if I turn one of the resonance up halfway, you're going to hear it on one side, not the other. Which is definitely an interesting stereo effect. And if I turn them both up identically, then they'll be the same on both sides. And like most analog filters, I can drive this all the way up into self-oscillation. So now I'm going to go to the series mode, and basically what it's going to do is your audio goes into a high pass filter, and which attenuates the lows, and then the output of that is going to go into the low pass filter, which attenuates the highs, and we're creating a bandpass filter because we're doing something to both the lows and the highs. And then the cutoff knob will move that, but by changing spacing, we're actually going to be able to change the width or Q of the bandpass filter. So resonance all the way off, I'm in the series mode, the spacing is set at normal, and hit a note. And with some resonance on both sides. Very interesting effects that are coming from having two resonant peaks in two different places because of the spacing, and their behavior is different because one's a high pass, one's a low pass. Now, the last mode, which probably creates the most interesting stereo effects, is the parallel mode. So one side is going to be a low pass, one side is going to be a high pass. And with some resonance on both. But the key thing when you're trying to program, trying to make decisions on these type of filters is keep your music simple. Keep it down to a simple note. Sometimes I like to do a perfect fifth. So here's the same sweep of the parallel, high pass, low pass, no resonance. And when you pick the filter, what you want to do is just start sweeping through it. Find some really interesting spots, or the sweet spots, or just anything that's doing what you want, and pay attention to what the low value is that you like and the high value is, because in further synth clips we are going to talk about how to set envelopes and LFOs and velocity and mod wheel and foot pedal and aftertouch, all to always live within the sweet spot that you've just found that you like for that patch. All right, so now I'm going to turn on the Arpeggiator just to run a bunch of notes, and I'll try and spread them out so that they go over multiple octaves. I'll use the 3 octave here on the Arpeggiator. And then I'll go through the different filter types and just kind of hear some of the sonic possibilities that you get with the series mode, the stereo mode, and the parallel mode. So here is the series mode where the high pass is going into the low pass, so I'm basically making a band pass that I can sweep around. Notice that it can get quite vowel-like because you have 2 filters working. Okay, now I'm going to switch to the stereo mode. I'll put the resonance down, the spacing back to normal. It should be pretty even on left and right side. And then I'll start playing with resonance on the different sides and spacing to see the differences. And notice that that's just one oscillator. So all of those extra notes that you're hearing are all because of the both resonant filters being separated. So very interesting thing there. So now I'm going to go to the parallel where one side will be high pass only, one side will be low pass only. Beautiful filter. All right, so now I'm going to pull out the ASM Hydrasynth because it also has a parallel filter path. Okay, so now I have the ASM Hydrasynth, and the reason I picked this one for the filter episode is because it has 2 filters, and the 2 filters are true stereo, each of them, and they have their own audio path, and they can be in series or parallel, so lots and lots of possibilities. So I want to just show you some of the preliminary thoughts on filter choices and routing choices. And so I'm going to start with, I have a knit patch, so I just have a sawtooth wave over here. And a really fascinating thing about the Hydrasynth is in the mixer section, not only do you have the volume of oscillator 1, oscillator 2, oscillator 3, ring modulation, which can also be audio brought in externally, and noise, you press the mixer button one more time. Now I can pan each of those sounds left or right, and I can also determine what percentage of them are going to filter 1 and what percentage are going to filter 2. And right now, I have the filters set to parallel. So filter 1 is going on its own path to the amp, and filter 2 is going on its own path to the amp. And this is a really good way to emphasize certain frequencies of a sound. So, for example, I'm going to go 100% to filter 1, and it's set to a low-pass filter, and I'm going to do the cutoff. And I'm going to turn up the resonance. And the more I turn up the resonance, the more it seems like you have less bass. Basically, you're boosting wherever your cutoff frequency is a lot compared to all the other frequencies. So if you're moving that in the higher ranges, your bass is going to seem like there's a lot less energy, and there is less energy. And so one of the tricks you can do with a parallel filter path is also send some of that oscillator to a different filter without resonance that's boosting the lower frequencies and add them back in. And so here is my resonant low-pass filter, filter 1, but now I'm going to change the mixer to send the oscillator to filter 2 only. So now I'm back to my original sound. And what I'm going to do is roll off, I got it set to a low pass, I'm going to roll off the high end until there's just bass. And now, by using the mixer, where I can pan how much it's going to use each filter, I can start with my very resonant low-pass filter. And now I'm going to slowly mix in some of that bass that I have going to filter 2. And you can hear the bass stays fairly consistent because it has its own audio path. Just one of the many things you can do. And then, like the Matriarch, you can change the filter routing to series. And now there's all kinds of things you can do because you're filtering it with one type of filter and then taking the result of that sound and going into the next filter. And so you can really create shapes that you couldn't create with a single filter because they tend to just do things like this. So I can have, for example, and then a different resonant cutoff on filter 1. Or let's say I like this sound, but I need some of the low end removed. So I'd make my second filter a high-pass filter. And so I can remove some of the bottom end, but I can still sweep the resonant low-pass filter. And then I can do a balance of those two ratios of the filters. So here's only the top one, here's only the bottom one. And so now what I'm doing is I'm actually sending a little bit of sound to filter 2 without it going through filter 1. So all kinds of craziness happens. And the best way to hear these things is, again, keep things simple and just play an individual note or fifths or an octave and a fifth. And just sweep and sweep slowly and sweep each of the parameters and listen to what it's doing. Once you find something you like, regardless of which knob it is, pay attention to what the minimum is and what the maximum is. And in another episode, we're going to talk about how to assign, again, the LFOs and the envelopes and velocity and aftertouch and mod wheel and any other controllers to sweep those parameters within the range that you like. And that's the essence of creating patches that you like. So this has just been a short talk about choosing your different filter types. If you have any further questions about the Matriarch or the Hydrasynth or the Grandmother or any of the synths you've seen in these, please contact your Sweetwater sales engineer. If you want to see the playlist of all these in a row, you can just click on the link in the info section. My name is Daniel Fisher. Thank you very much for watching.